Okay, so you want to own a franchise restaurant. You've seen the pitch: a recognizable logo, a proven menu, customers who already trust the brand before you've even opened the doors, a business in a box that somebody else already figured out. You just show up, follow the manual, and collect the profits. That's the plan in your head, and it's not a crazy plan. Franchising built entire empires this way. Millions of people work inside buildings that carry someone else's name and make a very good living doing it. Here's the problem. You are not actually buying a restaurant. You are buying a long-term contract with a company whose incentives are only partially aligned with yours. And the gap between those two incentives is where almost every franchise horror story begins. The truth is that a franchise restaurant is not really a food business. It is a licensing business that happens to sell food. And once you understand that difference, everything about how a franchise restaurant makes money and how it quietly bleeds an owner dry starts to make sense. Let's start with what it actually costs to get in the door, because the number on the glossy brochure is only the beginning of the story. There isn't one type of franchise restaurant. There's an entire ladder, and each rung is a completely different financial commitment. At the very bottom, you have low-investment concepts, food trucks, small kiosks, health food vending operations, where liquid capital requirements can start around $50,000. One rung up, you find fast casual and quick service concepts, the kind with a drive-through and a menu board, where total investment typically runs somewhere between $200,000 and $2 million depending on the brand and the build-out. Climb higher and you hit full-service, sit-down restaurant franchises, where total investment for a single location can range from $90,000 on the small end all the way up to over $4 million for a large format concept with a full bar and a real kitchen. And at the very top of the ladder sit the mega format quick service brands, the ones you'd recognize instantly from the highway, where a single prototypical restaurant can require an initial investment of close to $2 million on the low end and over $4 million on the high end before you've even bought the land underneath it. Now, here's where the naive mental model starts to break down. You think the big number is the franchise fee, the check you write to license the brand name. It isn't. The franchise fee, the actual payment for the right to use the logo, the systems, and the training, usually lands somewhere between $10,000 and $50,000. Some premium brands push it toward $100,000. A tiny handful push it as high as $1 million. But on a total investment that can run into the millions, the fee is often just a rounding error. It's the entry ticket, not the cost of the ride. The real money goes somewhere else entirely: the building itself. Real estate cost for a franchise restaurant can range from $100,000 to over $1 million, depending heavily on your market and your footprint. Then comes the kitchen, and this is where costs diverge wildly depending on what you're actually cooking. A concept built around fryers, grills, and open-flame cooking needs a full commercial-grade ventilation hood system, fire suppression equipment, and heavy-duty gas lines, a six-figure infrastructure burden that shows up before a single piece of food has been prepared. A concept that avoids that kind of heavy kitchen infrastructure can cut its build-out costs meaningfully, which is exactly why so many newer franchise concepts are built around assembly line food that needs less flame and less venting. And layered on top of construction, you have a 3-month operating fund requirement that many franchisors build directly into their disclosure documents, covering your first quarter of payroll, inventory, utilities, and insurance before the location has proven it can support itself. On one real large format quick service brand, that operating fund alone runs between roughly $165,000 and $458,000, and that's before rent, marketing fees, or a single royalty payment. Add it all together: franchise fee, real estate, build-out, kitchen equipment, signage, initial inventory, opening marketing, and that 3-month cushion. And even a mid-tier franchise restaurant can require anywhere from $500,000 to well over $2 million just to unlock the front door. For some of the largest quick-service prototypes, the number climbs past $4 million before you've served a single customer. So far, this sounds like it's simply an expensive business to get into. Now, let's talk about what happens after you're in, because this is where the story most people never hear actually begins. Here's the decision that trips people up before they even sign anything. What exactly are you paying for on an ongoing basis, and who actually benefits from it? Every franchise restaurant comes with 2 recurring bills stacked on top of your regular operating costs. The first is the royalty fee, typically somewhere between 3 and 9% of your gross sales, paid to the franchisor every single month, forever, for as long as you operate under their name. The second is an advertising or marketing fee, often another 2 to 4% of gross sales, funding a shared national ad fund that promotes the brand as a whole, not your specific location. Stack those together, and many restaurant franchise systems are quietly taking somewhere between 8 and 12% of every dollar that crosses your register before you've paid for a single ounce of food, a single hour of labor, or a single dollar of rent. Notice what that number is based on. Gross sales, not profit, not what's left after you've paid your staff and your food costs and your electric bill. Gross sales, which means the franchisor gets paid whether your location is thriving or barely surviving. If you have a slow month where food costs spike and your margins get crushed, your royalty bill doesn't shrink to match. It's calculated the same way regardless of whether you made money that month or lost it. The franchisor's revenue is stable and predictable. Yours is the one absorbing all the volatility. This is the single most important idea in the entire franchise restaurant business, and it's worth slowing down to really sit with it. The franchisor and the franchisee are not actually in the same business. The franchisor's business is selling licenses and collecting royalties at scale across hundreds or thousands of locations. Your business is running one restaurant, absorbing local rent, local labor costs, local competition, and local bad luck. The franchisor makes money the moment you open your doors and keep them open, regardless of whether you personally take home a single dollar of the profit that year. That misalignment doesn't automatically make franchising a bad deal. Plenty of franchise systems genuinely support their operators and grow because operators succeed. But the incentive gap is real, and in the worst cases, it becomes the entire story of how a franchise system collapses. Let's talk about food costs, because this is the second hidden layer almost nobody budgets for correctly going in. In a standalone independent restaurant, you can shop around for suppliers, negotiate pricing, switch vendors if one starts overcharging you. In many franchise systems, you can't. A significant number of franchise agreements require you to purchase inventory, packaging, and supplies exclusively through franchisor-approved distributors. Sometimes distributors the franchisor itself owns. That arrangement can be completely reasonable, ensuring consistent quality across every location carrying the brand name. But it can also become something much darker, a second, quieter revenue stream for the franchisor sitting on top of the royalty fee. One where the franchisor profits every time you buy a case of napkins or a box of chicken, regardless of whether your location is profitable. We'll come back to exactly how badly that specific mechanism can go wrong, because there's a real case study that shows precisely what happens when it does. First, let's finish the picture of what it costs to simply operate day to day, because the fixed and semi-fixed costs stack up fast, and stacking is exactly the right word. Rent on a franchise restaurant location typically runs alongside a percentage of sales clause in higher traffic real estate, meaning your landlord, just like your franchisor, gets a cut that rises when business is good and doesn't necessarily fall enough when business is bad. Labor costs for a full-service restaurant with a kitchen staff, servers, and management can easily consume 30% or more of revenue in many markets. Food and beverage costs, the raw ingredients themselves, typically eat another 28 to 35%. Insurance, utilities, equipment maintenance, point-of-sale system fees, uniforms, cleaning supplies, pest control. None of these show up as a single dramatic line item, but stacked together month after month, they quietly consume the exact margin an owner was counting on when they signed the franchise agreement. Do the arithmetic on that stack. Royalty and advertising fees around 8 to 12%. Food costs around 30%. Labor around 30%. Rent, often 8 to 10% of sales in a percentage lease deal. Insurance, utilities, and maintenance, another 5 to 8%. Add those up, and you're already somewhere between 81 and 90% of every dollar of revenue spoken for before you've paid down a single dollar of the debt you took on to build the place in the first place. The margin that's actually left over, the number that determines whether this was a good decision or a very expensive mistake, can be a razor-thin slice sitting right at the edge of the whole structure. Now, here's where the psychology becomes just as important as the math. Why do people keep signing these agreements despite the thin margins? Part of it is the appeal of a proven system. A franchise removes the terrifying uncertainty of a completely original restaurant concept. You know roughly what the food costs, roughly what customers expect, roughly what the four walls need to look like. Part of it is access to financing. Banks and the Small Business Administration are often far more willing to lend against a known, branded concept with a track record than against someone's original recipe and a dream. And part of it is simple trust in the brand's marketing muscle, the belief that a recognizable logo will fill seats faster than an unknown name ever could on its own. That trust is not irrational. It's exactly why franchising works at all, most of the time. But that trust becomes dangerous the moment a franchisor's own financial structure starts depending on extracting more from its operators than the operators can sustainably provide. And that is exactly what happened in one of the most well-documented collapses in modern restaurant franchising history. There's a physical day-to-day dimension to this psychology too, one that plays out in how franchise locations are actually designed. Franchisors spend enormous effort standardizing the look and feel of every location, not out of aesthetic preference, but because consistency itself is the product. A customer who has a good experience at one location needs to trust that the next location, in a different city, in a different state, will deliver exactly the same experience. That's the entire value proposition of a recognizable brand, and it's why franchise agreements typically dictate everything down to the paint color, the uniform, the exact plating of the food, and the script employees follow at the register. For the franchisee, that level of control cuts both ways. It removes a huge amount of guesswork about what works. It also means you have very little room to adapt to your specific local market, even when you can see, from behind the counter, exactly what your customers actually want that the corporate playbook doesn't offer. Meet Quiznos. At its peak in 2007, Quiznos was the second-largest submarine sandwich chain in North America, running close to 4,700 U.S. locations and generating roughly $2 billion in annual revenue. It was a real, credible threat to Subway, with clever national advertising and an early, aggressive push into internet marketing. On paper, it looked like exactly the kind of franchise success story that gets held up as proof the model works. But how does the second-largest sandwich chain in the country end up filing for bankruptcy, collapsing from nearly 5,000 locations down to fewer than 400 within a decade? The answer isn't that people stopped wanting toasted sandwiches. The answer is structural, and it goes directly back to that hidden mandatory supply mechanism we just talked about. Quiznos required its franchisees to purchase food, packaging, and supplies exclusively through a company-owned distribution operation, at prices the franchisor itself controlled. Independent pricing analysis later showed that distributor was charging franchisees somewhere between 10 and 20% above comparable market rates for the same products. Think about what that actually means in practice. Every single ingredient that went into every single sandwich was quietly priced to generate a profit for the franchisor, on top of the royalty fee the franchisor was already collecting. The company wasn't just licensing a brand anymore. It had turned itself into a captive food distributor, extracting margin from operators twice over, once through royalties and again through marked-up supplies those operators had no legal ability to shop around for. The results were catastrophic for the people actually running the stores. By the middle of the 2000s, the Wall Street Journal reported that even the top-performing Quiznos franchisees were earning more than a third less than the average franchisee had earned just a few years earlier. Roughly 10,000 franchise owners eventually joined class action litigation, alleging the company had effectively turned them into captive customers rather than genuine business partners. Quiznos settled that litigation for roughly $200 million, and additional franchisee lawsuits over locations that were sold but never even successfully opened added another $95 million on top of that. Layer a leveraged buyout on top of all of this, a private equity deal that loaded the company with $875 million in debt on the assumption the chain could keep growing fast enough to service it, and you have every ingredient required for collapse. When growth stalled because operators could no longer make money, the debt didn't stall with it. Quiznos filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in March of 2014. By 2017, the chain that once had almost 5,000 locations was down to a few hundred. Here is the structural lesson underneath that entire story, and it's the one thing every prospective franchise owner needs to internalize before signing anything. A franchise system doesn't fail because customers stop wanting the product. It fails when the financial relationship between the franchisor and the franchisee stops being mutually sustainable, and the franchisor keeps extracting value even after that relationship has tipped into being extractive rather than supportive. From the outside, Quiznos looked for years like a thriving, expanding brand. New store openings kept happening. The advertising kept running. It was only when you looked inside the actual unit economics, what a single franchisee was really keeping after royalties, marked up supplies, and debt service, that the rot became visible. And by the time that rot became visible to the public, thousands of individual operators had already lost their life savings. That's not an isolated story either. It's a pattern that shows up across the industry whenever a franchise agreement leans too heavily in the franchisor's favor. Which raises the obvious question: how do you tell, before you sign, whether you're looking at a healthy franchise system or the next slow-motion collapse? This is where the franchise disclosure document becomes the single most important piece of paper in the entire process, and specifically, one section inside it that most first-time buyers skim right past. It's called Item 20, and it's legally required to show exactly how many franchised units opened, closed, transferred, or were terminated over each of the past 3 years. A healthy, growing system shows more openings than closures, year after year. A system in trouble shows the opposite, closures and terminations quietly outpacing new openings, sometimes for years, before the collapse becomes public knowledge. By the time Quiznos actually filed for bankruptcy, that Item 20 data had already been showing negative net unit growth for years. The warning was sitting right there in a legally mandated disclosure document the entire time. Almost nobody who was buying in during those years actually read it that closely. There's a second document worth mentioning in the same breath, and it gets skipped even more often than Item 20 does. Most disclosure documents include an earnings claim, sometimes called Item 19, showing average revenue or profit figures across existing locations. Franchisors are not required to include this section at all, and a meaningful share choose not to, which is itself worth noticing. When a franchisor does provide earnings data, it's almost always presented as an average or a range across the entire system, a number that can look perfectly reasonable while still hiding enormous variation between the best-performing location and the worst. A brand where half its locations comfortably clear 6 figures in owner income and the other half lose money every year can produce an average that looks healthy on paper while describing a business that's actually a coin flip. Asking to speak directly with a sample of existing franchisees, ideally ones who joined more than 2 years ago rather than the newest, most enthusiastic recruits the franchisor is happy to connect you with, is one of the few due diligence steps that consistently surfaces the gap between the marketed average and the lived reality of running an actual location. Now, location. This is the decision most first-time franchise buyers get wrong, because they assume the franchisor's site approval process automatically means the real estate math works. It doesn't always. Franchisors typically set minimum criteria: a certain population density within a set radius, a minimum household income level, a certain amount of daily traffic passing the site, and a required lot size, often somewhere between 25,000 and 40,000 square feet for a quick service format with drive-through access wide enough to handle delivery trucks. Meeting those minimums gets your site approved. It does not guarantee your site is actually a good one relative to what you're paying in rent. 2 locations can both technically satisfy a franchisor's approval checklist while producing wildly different sales volumes, and the franchisor's incentive here is subtly different from yours again. The franchisor wants the brand represented in as many viable locations as possible. You want the single best location your budget can actually secure. Those 2 goals overlap most of the time, but not always, and a franchisee who defers entirely to the franchisor's real estate team without doing independent traffic and demographic homework can end up locked into a 20-year lease on a site that was good enough to get approved, but never good enough to actually thrive. Now, let's talk about why. Despite everything we've just walked through, franchising remains one of the most common paths into small business ownership in America, and why plenty of individual owners genuinely do build real wealth this way. The honest answer is that the same structure that can extract you dry can also, under the right conditions, meaningfully de-risk the business compared to building something from scratch. A well-run franchise system provides a tested menu, a proven store layout, negotiated national supplier contracts that can actually beat what an independent restaurant could get on its own, marketing that reaches far more people than a single local owner could ever afford, and operational playbooks refined across thousands of locations instead of one person's trial and error. For a first-time restaurant owner, that support can be the difference between failure in year 1 and a business that actually survives long enough to become profitable. There's also a path that experienced franchise operators use to escape the thin margin trap almost entirely: scale. A single location might generate a thin, fragile margin on its own, But an owner who operates 5, 10, or 20 locations under the same brand spreads fixed costs like a shared management team, shared marketing expertise, and shared purchasing leverage across a much larger revenue base. This is exactly how so-called multi-unit operators, franchisees who own dozens or even hundreds of locations across a single brand or several brands at once, build real wealth in this industry. Franchisors know this too, which is why many systems now offer multi-unit incentive programs, discounted fees, or accelerated development terms for operators willing to commit to opening several locations rather than just one. The economics of a single restaurant might be marginal. The economics of a well-run 20-location portfolio, spreading corporate overhead across a much larger base while maintaining the same percentage-based royalty and supply relationship with the franchisor, can look completely different. There's a second lever that separates the operators who thrive from the ones who quietly drown: which brand you pick in the first place, and specifically, how that brand structures its royalty. Not every franchise system takes its cut the same way. Some brands famously keep the upfront franchise fee remarkably low, sometimes as little as $10,000, but then take a much larger ongoing share, in some well-known cases as much as half of pre-tax profit, rather than a flat percentage of gross sales. That inverts the usual incentive problem we described earlier. When a franchisor's take is tied to your actual profit rather than your gross sales, the franchisor genuinely only makes real money when you do, which pushes their incentives back into alignment with yours in a way a pure percentage of gross sales royalty never fully achieves. It's a completely different financial relationship hiding behind what looks, on the surface, like a similar franchise fee structure. Reading past the headline number into exactly how and on what base the ongoing fees are calculated is often the single most important piece of due diligence a prospective owner can do. There's also a category of franchise buyer that operates almost entirely differently from the single location owner we've been describing so far, and it's worth understanding because it explains where the real fortunes in this industry actually get built. Large, multi-brand operating groups, some running hundreds of locations across several different franchise brands at once, function less like restaurant owners and more like private equity firms that happen to specialize in food service. These groups negotiate development agreements directly with franchisors, committing to open dozens of locations in a defined territory in exchange for reduced franchise fees, priority access to strong real estate, and sometimes even a small say in how supply contracts get structured. At that scale, the same percentage of gross sales royalty that quietly crushes a single struggling location becomes just another predictable input in a much larger, professionally managed portfolio, one with its own finance team, its own real estate department, and enough diversification across brands and geographies that one underperforming site barely moves the overall numbers. This is the version of franchising that shows up in business school case studies about wealth creation. It bears almost no resemblance to the experience of the individual who mortgages a house to open a single location and hopes the projections in the disclosure document hold up. Now, let's put all of this together and look at what actually happens over a full year, because this is where the two very different versions of this business reveal themselves. In the optimistic scenario, you've picked a franchise system with a genuinely healthy Item 20 track record, more openings than closures for several years running, a royalty structure that doesn't quietly punish you during slow months, and a location where the real estate math actually supports the brand's price point. You hit your break-even sales volume on schedule, your food and labor costs stay disciplined, and the brand's national marketing genuinely drives incremental traffic. Your own advertising budget could never afford on its own. Under those conditions, a well-run, single-unit franchise restaurant can generate anywhere from $800,000 to $2 million a year in revenue, with a net profit margin in the range of 6 to 15% once every fee, royalty, and operating cost has been paid. That can translate into owner earnings somewhere between $50,000 and $200,000 a year, a genuinely solid outcome, especially once you're running more than one location and spreading your fixed overhead across a larger base. In the realistic scenario, 2 or 3 things go wrong that aren't exotic at all. They're the ordinary risks of this exact business. Food costs spike because of a supply chain disruption, or a mandatory supplier price increase you have no ability to negotiate around. A new competing location, sometimes even a second franchisee from the very same brand, opens too close to yours and splits the customer base the franchise agreement never fully protected you from. Labor costs rise faster than menu prices can reasonably follow without losing customers to a cheaper option down the street. Under those conditions, that same restaurant can slide from a comfortable double-digit margin into a bare single-digit margin, or into an outright loss during a slow season, while the royalty and advertising fee keep arriving at the same percentage regardless of how thin that margin has become. The difference between those two outcomes for the exact same location in the exact same year can be well over $100,000, and almost none of that swing shows up as one dramatic, visible event. No scandal, no closure announcement, just a slightly higher food cost percentage, a slightly slower summer, and a royalty check that doesn't care either way, compounding quietly month after month until the number at the bottom of the spreadsheet looks nothing like the projection in the franchise disclosure document you signed 2 years earlier. There's one more number worth sitting with before we close, because it's the one figure that ties everything in this video together. Independent research into small business lending has repeatedly shown that franchise restaurants, particularly ones financed heavily through debt with thin operating margins, carry meaningfully higher loan default rates than many other categories of small business. That's not a coincidence, and it's not really about whether people want to eat at a given restaurant. It's the direct mathematical consequence of a structure where a fixed percentage of revenue is contractually owed to the franchisor and often to a mandatory supplier before the owner has covered rent, labor, and debt service. In a good year, that structure is barely noticeable, a modest tax on doing business in exchange for a proven playbook. In a bad year, that same fixed percentage becomes the exact thing standing between an owner and profitability, precisely when they can least afford it. Understanding that isn't a reason to avoid franchising altogether. It's a reason to treat the royalty and supply structure with the same seriousness most buyers reserve for the franchise fee, the number that gets all the attention in the brochure while quietly being the smallest number in the entire agreement. So if you do decide to buy into a franchise restaurant, remember the one thing that actually determines whether you succeed. It was never really about how good the food is or how recognizable the logo looks on the sign out front. It's about how carefully you read the fine print determining who gets paid first, who absorbs the risk when a bad month arrives, and whether the company whose name is on your building actually needs you to succeed or simply needs you to keep opening the doors.